Really glad you're here. Core Volunteer Training. It is a program created to help you, our supporters, and other new and newer volunteers to connect with each other around the larger world and help you meet your goals, your climate advocacy goals. So this week's key topic is economics of carbon fee and dividend policies. I am your host, Tamara Staten. I am CCL's Education and Resilience Coordinator, as well as our Greater Pacific Northwest Regional Coordinator. I think I win the prize for the longest titles in the organization. Thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, follow along with our slides tonight, cclusa.org/economics-CVT. So if we have done our job correctly this evening, you will be able to walk away with understanding the rationale for the three legs of CCL's flagship policy called carbon fee and dividend. You will also be able to describe those legs in your own words and how it would function within our country. And you might be able to address economic issues related to each of those legs, often raised by others with questions. Robert Archer is an economist by training with a BA from Yale and a master's from the University of Pittsburgh. He is a former Peace Corps volunteer and worked on energy reforms, regulatory development, and energy efficiency in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, South and Southeast Asia with the USAID, Agency for International Development. He comes to us tonight with over 30 years of experience working on economic policy for national and Washington, D.C. interests. He now spends his time generously volunteering for CCL, serves on the steering committee of the Marin, California CCL chapter, and is the leader of the CCL Economic Policy Network action team. So before I pass it to him, let me let you know what we're going to be doing this evening. Tonight's agenda, pretty straightforward. After a short introduction about the general public perception about carbon taxes, Bob will give you the why or the rationale for each element of CCL's three-part policy, including how it works, why it's important, and naturally the economic issues that are often brought up by Congress. He will also give you an opportunity, like I said, to weigh in with your ideas and thoughts. So we will make time for questions after each section with a more robust Q&A at the end to answer any remaining questions. So with that, I pass it to you, Bob.
Thank you. Before I start, good evening, first of all. And before I start, I want to ask you to contact and ask your senators to include a carbon price, specifically a fee and dividend, in the legislation that they are debating as we speak. And you can go through the CCL website to do that. Tamara read to you basically the first challenge we have, and that is that the challenge is global, and the policies that the US puts in place must be workable in developing countries where most climate emissions are occurring. This global perspective is both the starting and end point for this discussion. Now, the second slide shows people's concerns about a carbon tax. A synthesis of 26 studies was done to identify how to make carbon taxes more acceptable. It shows four main concerns that people have: personal cost impact on themselves, negative impact on low-income households, and mistrust the government wants the revenues and not emissions reduced. And fourth, that's not effective in discouraging high carbon behavior. The beauty of CCL's policy is that the first three are addressed directly by the equitable dividend. The study found that number four, the lack of understanding that the carbon fee reduces emissions, leads people to favor spending revenues on the clean energy projects instead of a carbon dividend, which hurts low and middle-income households. But the good news is that when people understand that the fee reduces emissions, the dividend becomes a preference over clean energy expenditures. So we in CCL need to communicate that the carbon fee is effective and revenues should protect low and middle-income households. So let's start with the basic economics underpinning the fee in the CCL policy. The next four slides will tell you the key impacts of the fee, behavior change among consumers, innovators, utilities, industries, and investors. We raise the price of fossil fuels and the demand goes down and emissions go down. This connection is not sufficiently understood or accepted. Two behavior changes occur by people: the substitution of cheaper alternatives and conservation or more efficient use. But the primary reason of why we have a fee is that our climate problem is due to a major market failure, resulting in negative external cost on us. So when a factory dumps its pollutions, such as CO2, in the air and water, the costs fall on us, not them. Without a carbon fee, we are subsidizing the fossil fuel industry to a massive degree. So there's no incentive for the polluter to change. So CCL's carbon fee puts the cost back on the cause of the pollution, fossil fuels. You may hear people say, get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. Are they just talking about tax breaks? Or do they recognize the biggest subsidy of all, free CO2 pollution without a carbon fee? Now, to date, the focus has been on the power of the fee to reduce emissions. There's a second and very important impact: the power to accelerate clean energy innovation. There's a point of view that governmental R&D is all we need, no carbon fee. However, a widely held view among academics, industry, and innovators is that a carbon fee will accelerate innovation and speed market adoption by providing strong incentives and by making fossil fuels more expensive. Bill Gates' new book recommends a carbon tax to accelerate innovation. Another good reason for a fee that has emerged in the last 6 to 12 months is to redirect financing. Today, most financing and investment is misallocated because fossil fuels are underpriced, making such investments misleadingly attractive. A carbon fee on fossil fuels will provide the financial sector more accurate information and steer financing into low and no carbon options. The U.S. Commodity Futures and Trading Commission has called for a carbon price in their recent study. Now, to get to the nuts and bolts of it, how much will this fee rise? You probably know it starts at $15 a ton of CO2 and rises $10 each year, or $15 if the emission targets aren't being met. And this is all in the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Most other proposals introduced in Congress start higher and escalate slower. It's important to have a predictable rising price. It sends a powerful economy-wide signal for investment and innovation, unlike regulation or cap and trade, which has not provided the trajectory, the predictability, or the environmental certainty as academic theory contends. So why start low and escalate when some other bills don't? Because it's important to avoid the economic shock and early political backlash. British Columbia and Canada started low and are rising and have avoided that kind of backlash. It allows planning and economic adjustment by industry, utilities, and us, households, and it provides a long-term clear signal to get the largest household behavior response. It's called tax salience. This is a field of economic research that shows that people are more likely to change their behavior in response to highly visible and highly salient taxes compared to their response to traditional market swings in prices like gasoline. Carbon critics who claim the fee won't impact behavior on car purchases and the use of cars are looking backward at traditional gasoline prices, not the magnified impact that's due to tax salience. There are a lot more reasons to support a carbon fee and cap and trade: the simplicity, transparency, efficiency, effectiveness, administrative ease, and what I think is one that's overlooked is it is a good fit for developing countries with weak institutions, serious corruption, and income inequality. This is an important and overlooked issue. How do you administer the fee? You use existing IRS and Treasury Department procedures, avoid creation of new bureaucracies. It's the simplicity of using existing systems. Basically, what the IRS is doing right now for COVID and stimulus payments is a dry run for implementing the household dividend. Where is it applied? Upstream. That means as close as possible to the mine, well, and point of importation. For coal, it could be imposed at the mine or approximately 500 coal preparation plants. There's a IRS tax form, excise tax form 720. You could add one line for the carbon content of the coal. For oil and gas, the fee can be placed at approximately 140 refineries and some 500 plus natural gas processing plants. So the bottom line is it's manageable. There's little question that the fee is going to have a big impact on emissions. The Stanford Energy Modeling Forum forecasts reductions at 26 to 50% by 2030, which far exceeds Paris Accord requirements. And Columbia University has also done some of the analytical work on this, showing that you can achieve very significant reductions between $55 and $105 a ton, which is approximately where the CCL trajectory will be between 2025 and 2030. Here's one issue I think that most climate policies avoid, and that's what the impact on households. Initial $15 fee will raise energy costs, household energy costs, about 5 to 10%. This will stimulate awareness and initiation of change behavior without economic shock and backlash. The average US home energy bill is about $2,060 a year. It's heating, cooling, water, heating, appliances, etc. So a 10% increase is $206. And the first year dividend will be somewhere in a range of $750 for a family of 4. So the rising cost will be more than covered. Now, one of the big issues, clearly big issues, is this issue of a carbon tax as a job and economy killer. To date, we've been dependent upon the models to kind of refute this, but that's changed. Gilbert Metcalf, Tufts University professor, and he's also a member of the CCL board, along with James Stacks of Harvard, did a really, really interesting study and published their research on the actual carbon tax impact in 31 European countries on economic growth and jobs. And the results are very encouraging. The carbon tax had no negative impact on GDP growth or employment, and maybe slightly positive in some cases. In other words, there is no basis for the view that carbon taxes kill growth or jobs. Well, jobs are a central narrative of the Biden administration climate initiative. You get 2 to 5 times more jobs in clean energy for every $1 million invested than in the fossil fuel industry. There are nearly 3 times as many clean energy jobs with roughly average wages, similar wages. So the trend is toward more jobs as what's called labor-intensive clean energy grows and fossil jobs decline. It's not all rosy, however. There is a need for complementary policies to address disproportionate regional impacts and different job requirements. For example, electric cars require 30% less labor. Now, what are some real life impacts of the carbon price, carbon fee? This is a good example in the UK. They imposed a carbon tax. They called it a carbon price floor on coal and natural gas for power generation, which caused an 85% decline in coal use from 2014 to 2017. The UK imposed it on top of the European Union cap and trade program. which was stagnant through that whole period at about $5 to $10 a ton. So here's an important political lesson as well learned from that. The UK green organizations, specifically Greenpeace, opposed it initially and now advocate for continuing it. I want to address a couple of myths, basically. Why are carbon prices low globally? Some say the fee doesn't work. Look at what's going on around the world. Because early first generation carbon tax policies around the world did not protect households and industries' two main constituencies. Carbon tax critics cite the low price, which was mostly cap and trade, as a reason fee and dividend won't work. They're comparing first generation carbon tax policies, that is, those with subnational coverage, no predictable carbon price, no household dividend, and no BCA, with what I call our fourth generation policy of wide coverage of all fossil fuels, a rising fee, and protection of the bottom 2/3 of households with a dividend, and a border carbon adjustment to address competition for US industries. These latter two features, the household dividend and the border carbon adjustment, address political scientists' claims that politicians won't support a carbon tax because of the supposed adverse impact on those groups. The second misconception is that some hold the view that industries will pass on all of the carbon fee to consumers and continue their business as usual spending. That's not the case. In fact, the carbon fee affects all industries, businesses, governments, utilities, consumers, some greatly, some less so. Billions of investment and consumption decisions are affected each day, like that quote at the beginning of this presentation. Most industries have to absorb some of the rising energy input costs. Otherwise, they will risk losing customers. A study showed that selected industries pass on 25 to 75% of fossil energy costs to consumers, depending upon the industry's competitive position, their market power, and the availability of alternatives. In addition, industries shift some of the burden back up to fossil fuel industry suppliers by switching to clean energy options. And finally, one that is a little too frequent these days is that some critics state that carbon pricing hurts disadvantaged communities. The term carbon pricing conflates two very different policies, cap and trade and the carbon fee and dividend. The flaws of California's cap and trade have been projected onto the fee and dividend policy. Environmental justice groups have legitimate concerns about cap and trade. But when you hear this misconception, a good response is, which carbon pricing policy are you referring to? So there are 5 main economic takeaways. First, the fee is effective. Second, innovation will take off. Third, health benefits, local pollution reduction, and other co-benefits not captured in the modeling will be significant. And fourth, the economy and jobs will continue to grow. And fifth, the dividend is the most equitable policy. The second leg of the CCL policy, the dividend or household dividend or carbon dividend, as it's sometimes called. Who gets the dividend and how much? A full share for up to 2 adults, half shares for children up to 18. A family of 4 gets about $2,000 a year in year 3, over $3,000 a year in year 5, and approaching $4,000 a year in year 10. The total revenues are very large, reaching around $2.5 to $3 trillion over 10 years. That's greater than corporate income taxes. So you can understand what's going on Capitol Hill in this discussion. Everyone has a view on the use of the large revenues. Why a household dividend? There are 2 big reasons. The dividend's most equitable of all the policies and programs. We don't hear that debate too much in the climate dialogue. Also, it brings long-term policy durability. People like it and advocate for continuity of the fee. And it pumps money back into the economy at the consumer level, benefiting small and medium-sized businesses. It's the most equitable use of revenues. This is a Treasury Department slide, which you can't read most likely. The bottom 2/3 of households generally break even or come out ahead. Their dividend equals or exceeds the increased cost of energy and products, and it disproportionately benefits the very lowest income households. No other policy can claim that. Now, a CCL study of the impact of the fee and dividend on households shows there's very little difference among rural, suburban, and urban households. This is important given the general false perception that rural households are disproportionately affected because they drive more. The similarity in impact on households is because most of the carbon consumption from all groups is due to stuff, consumer goods we purchase, and not direct fossil fuel use for driving and heating. There are other ways to use the revenue that some advocate. The option of using tax cuts to offset the revenue from the fee, payroll and personal corporate tax cuts generally mean the benefits disproportionately accrue to higher income households. I'll discuss the use of revenues for clean energy programs at the very end. Canada is a real political success for many reasons. It refutes the political scientist's claims that a carbon tax is politically impossible. You can't put all those costs up front and the benefits are far into the future. Canada started with a $20 a ton carbon tax in April 2019, 2 years ago. It rises $10 a ton to $50 by 2022 and will reach $135 US in 2030. $135. It's on the books. 90% of the tax revenues are now returned to households through a tax credit, and most households come out ahead. So how does it do politically? The 2019 federal election validated the carbon tax despite strong conservative opposition. When the annual increase took place in April 2020, during the coronavirus economic recession, it proved political durability. Prime Minister Trudeau was quoted as saying, "Our plan on pricing pollution puts more money upfront into people's pockets than they would pay with the new price on pollution. We're going to continue to focus on putting more money in people's pockets to support them right across the country." The third point is, this year, the Supreme Court upheld the Canadian carbon tax. And the fourth point is, the Conservative Party leader this year switched to support a carbon tax. And the fifth and very important point is that Canada will shift to a quarterly check in the mail next year because people were generally unaware of the tax credit. This is validation of CCL's basic policy. Now, as I finish this discussion on the dividend, I have a question for you. Go to the chat, please. Why should revenues be used for household dividend instead of spending on renewable energy projects? Think about that, because that's a common issue in people's minds. While you're doing that, I want to rebut the whole issue that some media reports that carbon pricing is yesterday's news. Major industry organizations have been coming out for it in the last 6 months. And Senators Whitehouse and Schatz have put forward the Save Our Future Act in the Senate.
So Bob, we are seeing some responses in the chat. People are saying it encourages free market spending of households. It's more equitable. You don't address how some communities are disproportionately impacted by the carbon tax. Oh, that's a statement, sorry. So the costs of carbon tax don't fall on consumers, buying habits, incentive, lower households can get more money. Renewable energy projects will already be in a position to move forward because they would not be bound by the tax, whereas households don't always have a choice in how their energy products are produced.
Those are good. Those are good. Most renewable energy project development is by the private sector in the US because of the tax credits and utility arrangements. So it is going well and can use additional separate funding if necessary. Okay, let's go on to the third leg, the border carbon adjustment. This is a must-have feature to succeed on a global basis. And up until about 2 months ago, 3, 4, 5 months ago, the least discussed, until the Europeans said, we're going to start a border carbon adjustment in 2023. There are 3 key reasons why you want to do a border carbon adjustment. The first, you want to avoid loss of jobs and US competitiveness. Second, you want to avoid US industries moving to countries with no carbon price. That's called leakage. And third, when you have a border carbon adjustment, other countries that don't have a carbon price are pressured to adopt a comparable carbon price. This is a real and immediate issue. It's on Capitol Hill now. It's in Senate bills. It's being debated. CCL's June request was to Senate offices in particular to move toward adopting a border carbon adjustment. Now that the EU is moving toward that, and others appear to be following, the US must put in place a border carbon adjustment and a carbon fee. What is a border carbon adjustment? It's really 2 things. It's a tariff, which is basically a tax, placed on goods imported from, or secondly, a rebate on goods exported to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. The tariff and rebate can be calculated different ways. It can be based on the carbon content of the goods imported and exported, or the carbon price in the country. Let's use the actual US and European cases right now as our example to walk through this. The European Union has a carbon price around $50 a ton. Okay, that's pretty high. It used to be around $5 to $10 a ton, then it just shot up to 20, back to 15, up to 30, up to 50. Not good for planning, but that's where it is. We don't have a carbon price. So in this case, the adjustment has 2 parts. The EU, European Union, is going to put a border carbon adjustment on, a tariff, on US goods imported into Europe because the US has no equivalent price on carbon. And the EU will rebate on the exports of their industries to the US. US firms don't pay any carbon fee and have an unfair advantage, right, over the European competitors who pay $55 a ton. So US firms can export to EU countries and undercut European competitors. So to even the playing field, they're going to put that border carbon adjustment in place. It's going to affect the US. It's going to affect other countries that don't have that kind of carbon price. Now, if the US establishes its own carbon fee and border carbon adjustment, then the EU carbon duties or rebates don't apply to US companies. Everything goes back to the trading arrangements that existed in the first place, because both countries are paying their own carbon fees. So in summary, here's what happens if we don't have a fee and border carbon adjustment, and Europe does. US exports become more expensive in Europe. Therefore, European industry is relatively more competitive and they gain jobs. And European exports to the US become more competitive because they're getting the rebate on that carbon price in Europe. And that hurts US industry. So the net effect is that US industry loses sales, both exports to Europe and domestic sales due to the competition from Europe, and loses jobs without a border carbon adjustment and comparable carbon price. So you can see why this is getting a lot of attention on Capitol Hill, and a bill has actually been introduced by Senator Coons to do that. But there's not a carbon fee with that at this point, and that's why we all need to call. So to give you a sense which industries are at risk on this, there's a term called energy intensive trade exposed, EITE. Not a good acronym. This includes firms that use a lot of energy. That means 5% or more of your production cost, and are exposed to trade competition. It's 15% or more of your product is in trade. Europe proposes starting a border carbon adjustment on cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer, and electricity. So why did they do that? Because those are the industries that are most exposed. You can see that only 44 out of 500 industry groups are in this group, but metals, non-metallic minerals, cement, etc. Give you a feel for the impact, a $25 carbon fee would increase production costs somewhere between 4 and 12% for most of the industries, the heavy industries we're talking about. It would increase as the fee goes up. Who administers this border carbon adjustment? Existing institutions, once again. That's the advantage of this fee dividend border carbon adjustment. Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, the funds collected are separate from the carbon fee. Funds cover administrative costs. And since the US imports more goods than it exports, the funds build up over time. Another issue that comes up is the legal issue around a border carbon adjustment. There is legal precedent for doing this kind of thing. I'm not going to go into the details of the most favored nation and national treatment issues under the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, but skip here to the next slide, which talks about Article 20. Very important article. General exceptions allows discriminatory practice for environmental reasons. So the fee and dividend with a border carbon adjustment is going to fit under that. If you have a border carbon adjustment without a fee, there's some real questions about it. So we arrive full circle from the first slide. Climate change is global, and CCL is working for a national carbon fee and border carbon adjustment that incentivizes other countries. So the US policy must be one that addresses the free rider problem, incentivizes countries to participate, and is a good fit for developing countries with weak institutions, corruption, and income inequality. The CCL policy meets these requirements. Other climate policies do not. Subnational initiatives, cities, states, and regions are helpful, but only a national approach can impose border carbon adjustments which encourage carbon price harmonization around the world. So how do you get there? Maybe the most pragmatic and promising path to harmonizing global pricing is a multilateral carbon pricing agreement among a subset of nations. It's called a club. The Club of Carbon Club or Club. They would have a common carbon price and a border carbon adjustment that incentivizes others to join the club. For example, the EU, already leading, Canada, the UK, Japan, who are also expressing interest, the US, and ideally China and India could start a club. The Paris Agreement is based on ambition, has no enforcement, and is unlikely to achieve the necessary reductions voluntarily. The newspapers in Asian countries that export to Europe are full of articles on the potential impact of a border carbon adjustment on their industries if they don't have a carbon price. So thanks to the European initiative, this is all coming to the fore. I'm going to ask if we can post the Australian article in the chat that I just read, and it gives you some real insight into how this would affect those exporting countries and the concerns that they have. So let's, if you could post that, Tamara.
It's there, Bob.
Okay. So I want to sum up here and then just speak a couple minutes about regulation and subsidies. The fee works by raising the prices, which reduce demand and emissions. It's a steady rising price affecting all sectors, fosters innovation and investment, and has benign economic impacts. In terms of the revenue, a dividend goes back to people. It's the most equitable use. It protects households and builds constituency support. Tax swaps, clean energy expenditures can be regressive. The border carbon adjustment addresses unfair foreign competition. It encourages free rider countries to adopt a carbon fee. It incentivizes global carbon pricing and simplifies agreements. You're likely aware of the House Climate Select Committee report on the climate crisis that was published a while back. It gave priority to policies involving subsidies, regulations, and standards, 540 pages and hundreds of bills and recommendations. It gave little attention or priority to carbon pricing. Most of the proposed regulatory programs have 20 to 30 years of experience. So let's take a look at some of the experience of these subsidies and regulations that have been studied pretty extensively, including by University of California, Berkeley. We are asked increasingly, why not regulation, standards, and subsidies? And experience shows the following: that subsidies have been inequitable. The University of California, Berkeley analysis. Regulations cost more and are less effective, as described by the International Monetary Fund in their analyses. So the question comes back to, why not use carbon fees for clean energy subsidies instead of a household dividend? If you do that, the revenues from the carbon fee for energy subsidies, which have been going on for solar, wind, and efficiency, has two equity downsides. First, the households don't get the dividend and costs are going up for them. And second, clean energy subsidies, based on the experience, go disproportionately to higher income households. Only 10% of the benefits went to the bottom 60%. The upper 20% of households received 60% of the benefits. We're talking here about the most equitable tax credits has been for electric vehicles, where the upper 20% got 90% of the subsidies. Same is true in California for rooftop solar, for example. So that's why I come to this final central message, that the fee and dividend needs to be the foundational policy that is primary, essential, and economy-wide, not covering only the electricity sector like a clean electricity standard, which will address 27% of the emissions. Truly complementary regulations and subsidies are also needed to augment. Some experts suggest the following guideline for determining when subsidies and regulations are justified. First, when a carbon fee does not impact a sector's emissions at all, for example, enteric fermentation, cattle, soil carbon sequestration, forest and agriculture. And second, when the fee does not impact a sector sufficiently, such as rental housing, where you have landlord and tenants have different incentives, that's where you need complementary regulation, like housing codes and LIHEAP, low-income energy efficiency programs. would be justified in that case. So I'm convinced, after looking at all this, that this carbon fee and dividend needs to be central and significant.
So I just want to thank you very much for being here this evening. Thank you, Bob, for your great information and all the preparations you made for tonight's webinar. If you do have any questions, you can ask them in the forums at community.citizensclimate.org/forums. You can visit the Economics Policy Network as well, or you can email Bob himself, archer.robert2@gmail.com. Thank you for being here, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.